And we're going to shift gears here a little bit, but it's still an important aspect of land management strategies, and something that as we're thinking about developing planning strategies for oak woodlands that we take into account, and that's the whole area of fuels and fire management and fire issues. And to talk to us about that topic, we have Bill Stewart. Bill is a Cooperative Extension Forest Management Specialist housed at the UC Berkeley campus. He also serves as the director of the Center for Forestry and also the co-director of the Center for Fire. I can't remember the exact topic. Bill will tell us in just a moment here, perhaps. But Bill will talk to us about fuels and fire issues in oak woodlands. So, Bill, it's all yours.
Okay, thanks everybody for joining in today. So I just want to try to take, I think this can be more of a non-technical look at fuels and fire issues in the oak woodlands, and I'm going to put a lot of focusing on really how Californians think about those two issues. And you know, they're not really singular issues. They're really important is how they affect other aspects of oak woodlands that people appreciate or are concerned about. This is just a picture of that the editors of the California Agriculture chose for an article we just did on landowner perspectives in California. And I think it's interesting that this was the photo they chose rather than of a forest or a lake, because this really shows that people love to be inside the oak woodland mosaic. And they love it so much, they like to put houses in there because this is really where they want to live and see it. And I think it's important. It really is. The oak woodlands are a very iconic landscape of California, and the time is when people really love to look at and think about them is when they are this bright green color. But as we know, they're not always like that, and always within a Mediterranean climate here in California. These areas do have fuel. We have a 6-month or 12-month or 9-month dry season. And fires can occur, and sometimes those fires are really scary, like the one on the top, and sometimes they're not so scary, like the one on the bottom. And I think when we're thinking about fuels and fire, especially if people that have a technical background in it, we often kind of don't think about the emotional issue here, because one reason why this is one on the top is a scary photo is not so much the size of the flames. If they're out in the central Amazon, people might just think they're interesting. It's because there's a house right there. It's the proximity to the house that makes it scary. The not so scary one reason is there's a fire truck right there watching to make sure it stays small. It's the idea that it's a managed fire. This is a prescribed fire. The flames are a lot lower. But so I think it's really important to think about this, because most people, when they're thinking about fuels and fire, only happens when it's a big incident, and what they see on the newspaper is more the scary shots and not the not so scary shots. But you know, fire is quite common, especially in the oak woodlands of California. This is a map from Bill Tichy of about a 50-year map of fires that occurred across San Luis Obispo County. And you see that most of the fires we get in California are wildfires and not prescribed fires. The prescribed fires are planned, but they're harder to do. You have to get everyone involved. They're a little bit more expensive. Those wildfires, they just come for free. It costs money to put them out, but they do actually affect a lot of the landscape. And how intense either of these fires are is really going to make a big difference on what the impacts are going to be. And whether the purpose of both the prescribed fires are in many respects similar to some of the wildfires, if those wildfires are of kind of mixed severity with smaller flame lengths, that 2 or 3 years after the event, it'll actually look to be just as nice an environment it was as people perceived before the fire. Today I'm not, I think as I said before, I'm not going to try to go over a lot of the technical information about fires in the oak woodlands. It's, for some of you know, here's a link to the California Strategic Fire Plan, which covers a lot of this information. And we also know that for all the state responsibility area, as well as the local responsibility area where private lands are, there's fairly detailed fuels and fire hazard maps that have been created and given to all the cities and counties to integrate into their planning documents. So that's it out there, and if you want access to that, here's one of the websites on there, but you can actually migrate that, get to that. What I want to talk about today is just to kind of broaden the perspective, is to think about some non-fire department perspectives on fuels and fire. To think, first of all, from the point of view of the private landowners that own most of the oak woodlands in California. And then second, to think about the public, how they think about it. They have an influence in this because they vote in local city elections, in counties, at the state, for various entities that have policies that can affect the management of fuels and fire. And finally, I want to kind of get back to some issues as one kind of very common theme of what's really going to be affected by fires in the oak woodlands. And I think a lot of the issues is something that everybody seems to really have a shared interest in. This are the animals that actually live in the oak woodlands, and the different types of vegetations and how fires are going to impact them in both the short term and the long term. And I will put up at the end of the time those URLs for the various publications I'm referring to on my last slide. So I think it's important to think about, especially if we can think about oak woodlands, how it affects us as a professional or an agency person, but I think it's very important to think about why the people that live and own the oak woodlands, how do they think about it? And first of all, what we found when we've done our work is why it's really important. It is their home. That's where their house is out there. They live there, and often that's the most important aspect, is the safety of their home when they're thinking about fuels and fire. That's their first priority to think about that. And I think that's always important to stress, even though much of the discussion might be about the ecosystem effects or the cost of fire suppression. At the end of the day, what really drives people to live out there is it going to destroy my home or not? A second issue is, for many people, those oak woodlands they're part of the money-making. It's a family business. If people have especially grazing operations, this is much more common for people that own at least 500 acres or more of land. There's some real economies of scale if you're going to actually try to keep track of all those animals out there. But for much of the oak woodlands in California, those are working ranches. And the fire and the fuels issues, they are going to take a backseat to thinking about how they fit into the family business and not just be a separate topic. But I think for all those people, it's always important to remember that both the woodlands themselves and how fuels management and fires are affected is how it affects their lifestyle. First of all the surveys we've done, people really think they live in the oak woodlands because of their positive sense of community. People live there for decades, or people that moved there. They're there because they really want to be there, and they have a real appreciation for their neighbors, who, as we'll get in later, are people they may need to cooperate with if they're going to do any fuels management activities. But also remember, when people live in these oak woodland landscapes, they don't just live in the oak woodland landscape. They often are going to develop part of that landscape. They might plant gardens. They might put in trees to block the wind, to change the view. They might put in flowering trees or shrubs. And it's important to think about those, because a lot of those planted parts of the landscape can actually be much more flammable than the natural vegetation that's out there. And that's actually, in many respects, in oak woodlands, or as it moves into the shrubland, are things to think about, especially in terms of planning or professional advice we give to people. And finally, people, one reason they're out there in the oak woodlands is they want to be able to use those lands. They want to raise animals, not just cattle, but often llamas and alpacas and goats, and they want to grow crops there. And also many people still use the land, especially large areas, for hunting, collecting firewood, and activities like that. So when we're thinking about fuels and fire, it's always important to think why people originally appreciate the oak woodlands, and how will fuels management or fires affect those higher value or issues, rather than kind of the technical issues of fire and fuels management. And this table, I don't know, hopefully people can see that this is a table of questions we ask different types of landowners, what management practices they do on forest and rangelands. And I just picked out a few of the ones that relate to fuels and fire. And and just there on the left, you see one of the the second most common activity people do is clear defensible space. This is people understand that during the Mediterranean climate, it's risky to have lots of stuff that can catch your house on fire. So they are willing to think about that and do something about that. That's a huge activity. Another activity that's right up there at the top is actually pruning trees to reduce risk. In some cases, especially if they're overhanging their deck or their house or they're right next to their area, to actually cut some of them back so that possibly if the flames come from the grassland, they don't catch into the trees and catch the whole tree on fire. What's I think is also useful to think about way down at the bottom is not that many people are thinking about using prescribed fire on their landscape. And even less people actually like to write management plans about how they're managing their land. So for people like myself who spent years working for a fire department and worked on prescribed fire, we think that's kind of normal, but it isn't that commonly held view of writing a written management plan and using prescribed fire. It's a tool, but it's not going to be a tool that most people, especially with kind of small and medium-sized parcels, are going to use. So I think the other point of looking at this is, what I notice in this is the other management goals people have, they really want to improve positive aspects of these woodlands. So if the fires or fuels management can improve forest health, wildlife habitats, and water quality, those are probably stronger ways of getting people involved in thinking about fuels management than just telling them, well, I went to school and I learned the prescribed fires work, so you should do them too. That's been tried for decades in the West, and it's not that successful in convincing people that you're going to get that, because when in their mind, they remember that picture of those really large flames right outside their house, and they're worried about their house burning down. So I think this is one thing we've learned is really protecting the home is really the #1 concern when it comes to fires people think about in California. And you're never, even if you own most of the land around your home, you may not be able to stop all the embers that might be flying in from your neighbor's home or other issues. So it's really important to assume that something's going to happen in your home and actually make your house much more fire resilient to all those things that are going to affect it. And that's, there's a website, we'll show it at the end, but this is one thing, a big focus of, we worked at what we call our toolkit at our fire center site, just the ways people can actually make the homes they have out there that are typically built with wood to make sure if a fire comes, it is going to survive. Another point that's really important, and this comes out a lot in Southern California, is when people plant vegetation they bought because it had pretty flowers or it didn't need a lot of rain, that it isn't going to catch on fire and actually start to help burn your house down. And this is right here is a link to a publication that Sabrina Drill out of our Southern California Cooperative Extension worked on, called Safe Landscapes, to help people think about different types of plants you can buy at a nursery, but there may or may not be the right things to plant if you're living out in the oak woodlands and you're thinking about, well, when a fire comes, do I want to be responsible for accelerating the speed that fire is coming towards my house, or actually make sure it actually stays a little bit away. But I think when you move away from the home, and this is really important for larger, it's easier for larger ownerships that people have 50, 100, 200, 1,000 acres, is that all the survey work we've done is that, and it isn't just the Department of Fish and Game, but improving wildlife habitat is a very strongly held value for most Californians. And so they want to think about when both the treatment they do the land, and after there's been a fire, what they're going to do to possibly some of the trees are burned or dead, whether they should take them out as firewood or leave them for habitat values, and what kind of fires might actually be good for the animals. Most of these animals evolve with having fires in the California landscapes, and so which ones are actually going to bring back. They may in the short term burn down 3 of the 10 trees, the broken trees they lived underneath, but it might have actually increased the amount of grass that they can eat in the other times of year. And so I think one thing that we've seen most people that look both from the wildlife habitat point of view and from the fire is that mixed severity fires, if you have some level of patchiness, it's better for everybody than having really big hot fires that when you have a very dense vegetation covering the whole area. One of the things on the burn trees, Californians historically, we often, I did this when I was in high school, go out there and cut the dead trees and sell them as firewood in the city. But in many respects, first of all, some of the trees that are burned, they may actually come back again. Just because there's a lot of scorching on them may not mean they're dead. And also many of them, if you leave them, some of those are quite important for wildlife. The burned trees often have a higher chance of developing cavities in them for birds and mammals that use them. So it's important to think about that every tree that has been damaged may not be something you tell your teenage son or somebody else that don't take those trees out because they're not as valuable anymore because they're burned. They may actually be more valuable for wildlife with some level of burning on them. And here's just some pictures I got from Bill Tichy, some of the animals out there that often are, hopefully, some of them we hope to see, maybe some of the newts, some of them we don't really like to see too often, like the big rattlesnake there. But there are just lots of wildlife out there that live in the oak woodlands. Sometimes they're hard to see because they're the same color as the oak woodlands. But there's there's birds, there's small mammals, there's some of the amphibians, reptiles that are out there. And this is some of the areas that I think is really important from a fuels and fire, is to think about not just more fuels and fire, but actually think about why do we want that diverse landscape, and what are the other creatures out there that have lived through rounds of fire, and how can we actually track how they're doing with fires of different intensity. And so this is just some pictures also I got from Bill, thinking about both the impact of prescribed fires and what are often mixed severity fires that are natural, that extended, that weren't all burning at a hot level. One issue is if the habitat is sparser, there's a really good chance the fire might flare up and then come down and create that mix of habitats that didn't burn all of it down, but might actually increase the fuel in the next year, but actually leave some habitat for various species. And I think one of the major conclusions from a lot of the fire work is that as long as the fire isn't hot across the whole area, it actually is good for wildlife. They might drop that year for some species, but over a decade, some level of fire out there in the landscape, from a wildlife point of view, can actually fit. So if you can have fires don't burn down the infrastructure like the houses, barns, and roads, it is something that actually can be managed rather than attempting to put the fires out every time and end up over time. In some areas, we build up very high levels of fuel. So when the fire does come, and the really hot one like we had in the Oakland Hills, there's really no way anyone's going to stop it. And finally, I just want to bring it back to what people who live in the oak woodlands, who they really want to work with when we're thinking about interest in reducing and coordinating activities to reduce fire hazards. And I think this is what this is on the bottom side. We group people by the size of ownership they had, and really ask questions, well, who do you want to work with to reduce fire hazards in your area? And I think I see 3 points here. One is that everybody, whatever size they are, they want to work with their neighbors to do this together. Both because their neighbors are probably like them. If they live along a lot of ranches, their neighbors are probably ranches. And the same if they live in a 5-acre parcel, they're going to have smaller parcels. They do want to work with neighbors and be collaborative in that sense. Local planning agencies and CAL FIRE, they kind of bounce around, but they're kind of intermediate in terms of how much they want to work with them. Those are often the groups that are important to work with, especially if you're trying to get government funding and get your permits through. Those are very important. But they're kind of middle between kind of working with people, your neighbors. And then I think what is interesting at the bottom is people, especially as parcels get larger, aren't real excited about working with federal agencies who often have a lot of the technical specialists on collaborating with fire hazards. And I think this is an important thing for any group that's thinking about that, is that people, before they have perceptions of what other agencies' goals are. And until, I think, as Royce pointed out, until you get people together as stakeholders to talk through what different groups' goals are explicitly and what effort they're going to put into this so it works together, you do have a kind of, there's a good chance there's a little bit of distrust between landowners and various agencies until everybody essentially puts their cards out on the table. Finally, I just want to point out that there's a lot of different details. I didn't want to show any maps of places because every county and every local area has different areas of fire hazard. But here are some of the points, some online resources that I think are useful. Many of these are useful across wherever you are. The first one is the toolkit I described is tools from our fire center site of ways to make sure that homes and barns and outbuildings are actually more fire resilient. So links will be posted later. The second one is the Safe Landscapes brochure. That's very much more relevant for Los Angeles, Ventura, Riverside, San Diego counties. That really helps people think about the landscapes, especially what plants are going to be planted, because that's what people do when they live out in these areas. They will plant some things. They do want some greenery in the middle of the summertime. The third one is, I think, a useful publication of thinking about when a fire comes through. It may look like all the trees are dead because they're scorched, but many of them will survive. And this is a really good way of thinking about, for your own land, which ones are going to survive and resprout and which ones really probably are dead. And then you kind of have a different decision-making process. Do you want to take it out as firewood or let it finally stand up for a while and fall down and be kind of possibly a condominium for salamanders? And finally is the same link I showed for some of the resources from the California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection, which probably has the most detailed map-based and kind of fuels data that is relevant for every county in California. So those are my final points here, and if there's any further questions, I'd be glad to take them now or we can get them later.
Well, as Bill mentioned, we will post these links on the Oak Webinar website under supplemental reading so that you can go back and look at these at your a lot of good resources there. And why don't you answer that one question there from Anita?
Yeah, so Anita had a question. Is it possible that landowners don't want to work with federal agencies due to endangered species issues? We didn't specifically try to ask that, but I think there is, in some areas, there's a concern. And more, it's just no one's really, people don't see a lot of the federal agency people that often, so they're not really sure. There isn't clean language. If you're in, for instance, in Tehama County, what is the role of the federal agencies? They may be thinking about it something else. And I think this really brings up the issue is you do need to have face-to-face meetings or on the local radio station, people actually from these agencies talk about what they're trying to do there so that people have a better understanding of how to actually deal with these kind of shared goals and kind of so the resources can be pooled. The second one is, given that home, can you speak code preference for stick houses? I think we're talking about houses built with 2x4s. The main reason houses burn down often is not what the walls are made of, but how good the windows are to prevent being cracked under high heat conditions. And so it actually, whether you build your house with wood or not, it's not great to have wood on the outside. Stucco's a lot better. But a lot of it is the windows and the air vents, and a lot of other small pieces of the house are more important than what the walls are. If you leave basically one of those flammable, where you kind of clean your boots off in front of your door, if that's a flammable made of jute or something, that can actually burn your whole house down. Embers fall on that. So there's some very small things that have nothing to do with what the code preference is, but those are the ones you really need to think about cleaning up, so that if there's basically an ember shower on your house, to make sure you don't have stuff that's going to actually catch on fire long enough to burn it all down.
Why don't we, we'll stop right there. There's a couple more have come up.